group of civilians searching for missing relatives uncovered a site of an apparent mass killing.
The volunteers found ovens hidden under the earth, presumably where they were burned.
They had come searching for their family. Desperate families hoped for answers in the unforgiving land of Jalisco, Mexico. However, what they found on a quiet ranch in Danella was never meant to be uncovered. A place hidden in plain sight and a secret buried in silence. As they stood there, staring into the darkness, one thing became terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just a search anymore. It was a crime scene. Here's what scientists just discovered in Mexico terrifies the whole world. The mass grave that shook Mexico. It started with a tip. A hushed warning passed to a group of volunteers in March 2025, one that would send them on a journey into the heart of darkness. These weren't investigators or law enforcement officials. They were ordinary people searching for missing loved ones. However, nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to find. Deep in western Mexico, far from the bustling streets of Guadalajara, on the rural outskirts of La Estanzuela, Jalisco, they arrived at an abandoned ranch. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an empty shell, another casualty of Mexico's ongoing violence. However, then came the first clues, a faint, acrid smell in the air. Then, the ground gave up its secrets. Soon, this group of people uncovered 3 underground cremation ovens, burned human remains, and hundreds of bone fragments, brittle and charred. That wasn't all, though. Something else lurked in the ruins. Small figurines, eerie and deliberate, were placed near the remains. Santa Muerte, the so-called Holy Death, standing watch over the carnage. As the gruesome discovery sank in, Mexican authorities were called in. Investigators descended upon the site, combing through the wreckage and unearthing more horrifying details. Dozens of bullet casings, metal gripping rings, and evidence of restraint were found. One thing soon became clear. The ranch wasn't just a grave, it was a slaughterhouse. Within the same week of this discovery, the news was everywhere. Local newspapers and TV reports exploded with coverage, and a terrifying phrase began circulating among journalists and investigators alike: extermination camp. However, the most haunting truth? No one knows exactly how many people perished there. Not a single victim has been identified. The questions are as endless as they are disturbing. Who ran this extermination camp? How long had it been in operation? For now, there are no answers. Authorities have remained tight-lipped, offering no confirmation on who was responsible, how long the executions took place, or even the scale of the massacre. Now, at the request of President Claudia Sheinbaum, the State Attorney General's office has taken over the investigation. One thing was clear: this wasn't just another grim discovery. Finding evidence of the lives lost was heartbreaking. You see, photos taken by authorities and the volunteer group, Searching Warriors of Jalisco, painted a devastating picture of what had happened at the abandoned ranch. More than 200 shoes piled together like discarded memories. They also found a blue summer dress, a small pink backpack, notebooks, and pieces of clothes. In total, over 700 personal items were found. Yet the most infuriating part is that it wasn't the authorities who uncovered these grim clues. According to Juanita Gubertus, America's director at Human Rights Watch, it is shocking and disheartening that victims' family members, using picks and shovels, were forced to do the work. The same work authorities claimed to have done nearly 6 months earlier. The message was clear: the system had failed them. President Claudia Sheinbaum now faces a reckoning. Human rights groups are calling for immediate action, demanding that this horror doesn't get buried like so many before it. Gubertus urged Sheinbaum to launch an urgent nationwide effort to professionalize how state prosecutors investigate crimes, rather than leaving grieving families to dig through the dirt, searching for bones. However, the outrage is about more than just this ranch. Mexico has been bleeding for years. In a country where brutal cartel violence is a dark part of daily life, this discovery left an indelible mark. The images of that ranch, the shoes, the ashes, the shattered remains of so many lives, were too much to ignore. The discovery of the ranch in Jalisco wasn't just another grim reminder of Mexico's cartel-fueled violence. It was etched in tragedy. Now, its horrors have exploded into the public eye at the worst possible moment for President Claudia Sheinbaum. Sheinbaum, Trump, and the cartel war Mexico can't escape. For months, Sheinbaum has been walking a tightrope. On one side is the relentless brutality of Mexico's cartels, who take lives without hesitation and operate with near total impunity. On the other, a furious Donald Trump breathing down her neck, demanding action, fast. The former United States president has made no secret of his impatience. His threats have been clear. Either Sheinbaum cracks down on the cartels, or Mexico faces crippling tariffs on exports. Either she shows real progress, or she risks the nightmare scenario of U.S. military intervention, where American forces would storm across the border, hunting down cartel leaders on Mexican soil. Trump's pressure has forced Sheinbaum into one of the most aggressive anti-crime campaigns Mexico has seen in years. Experts say she is taking a harder stance than her predecessor, but it's a battle against an enemy that has spent decades digging its claws deep into every corner of Mexican society. The cartels are not just violent organizations, they are parallel governments, ruling entire territories with an iron grip. Of course, no cartel wields more power than the Jalisco New Generation cartel. Inside Jalisco's cartel training ground, its rise has been nothing short of ruthless. Born from the ashes of older crime syndicates in the early 2010s, it didn't just fight its way to the top, it dominated through sheer violence. It controls drug routes stretching from South America to the United States, pumping fentanyl and methamphetamine across borders, fueling an opioid crisis that has devastated communities far beyond Mexico's borders. However, trafficking isn't enough. It has expanded into illegal logging, human trafficking, extortion, and now, it seems, something even darker: mass slayings carried out with cold, industrial efficiency. Safe to say, the ranch in Jalisco is no ordinary crime scene. Indira Navarro, leader of the Searching Warriors of Jalisco, the volunteer group that uncovered the site, revealed something even more disturbing than the cremation ovens and mass graves. The ranch wasn't just a place to dispose of remains, it was a training ground. Navarro said multiple people had come forward with the same horrifying story. The site was used to train cartel recruits. New members were taught how to use weapons, how to torture, and how to end a life without hesitation. When training was over, the site became something else, a factory for the deceased. Who were these recruits, though? How did they end up at this training ground? Well, Navarro said that the cartel didn't just find recruits, they tricked them. False job offers were posted on social media, promising young people a fresh start, a steady income, and an escape from poverty. All they had to do was show up at a bus station in Guadalajara, the state capital. From there, a new life awaited them. Of course, not the kind they were expecting. You see, instead of jobs, they were met with something far more sinister. They were taken straight to the ranch, swallowed whole by the cartel's brutal world. Some were trained to fight and to torture. However, the true horror came when they were ordered to burn the remains of the cartel's victims. Some refused, and that's when things got even worse. Navarro recounted one young man's story. The recruits who objected to their orders weren't just punished. They were fed to wild animals, lions. A slow, merciless end, meant to instill fear in anyone who dared question the cartel's authority. "This is not a horror film," Navarro said in a radio interview, her voice heavy with grief. "This is our reality, and people should know about it." Now, what you need to consider also is that she speaks from experience. Her own brother vanished 9 years ago. She knows what it's like to live with that endless, gnawing uncertainty. However, do you know what the most chilling part of all of this is? Authorities knew about the ranch 6 months ago. How authorities ignored a cartel massacre until it was too late. Local officials first located the site last September. They found weapons, spent shell casings, and bone fragments. They even rescued 2 kidnapped people and found human remains. Yet, they stopped the investigation. Why? No one seems to have an answer. State Attorney General Salvador Gonzalez offered an excuse that feels weak in the face of such horror. "There are a lot of hectares in the area," he told the press, as if a few extra acres made it impossible to see piles of shoes, burned remains, and scattered clothing. President Claudia Sheinbaum isn't buying it. At a press conference, she hinted that local authorities may have been negligent, or worse. "It seems the truth is brutal, and it's out in the open now." For far too long, families of Mexico's disappeared have been forced to dig through the dirt with their own hands, searching for answers the government refuses to find. Groups like the Jalisco Search Warriors have taken on the heartbreaking task of uncovering mass graves, makeshift extermination sites, and the silent resting places of thousands. Now, at an abandoned ranch in Tuchitlan, they've done it again. More than 120,000 people have disappeared in Mexico. The number is staggering, but the real nightmare is this. If it weren't for these volunteer groups, how many more victims would remain hidden? In March 2025, under mounting public pressure, Jalisco State Prosecutor Salvador Gonzalez de los Santos finally returned to the ranch, where investigators found 6 groups of bones. They still don't know how many victims they belong to. Later, he was asked why they hadn't discovered all this sooner. He admitted it. Their previous efforts were insufficient. That's putting it lightly, no doubt. The discovery was so shocking that even Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, stepped in, ordering the federal attorney general's office to take over the investigation. Now, Navarro had accused the state's former governor, Enrique Alfaro, of trying to suppress discoveries like this. The Mexican Episcopal Conference has called it an irresponsible omission, a failure at every level of government. However, calling it an omission almost sounds too gentle. What happened in Tuchitlan is not just negligence. This is because the ranch in Jalisco is not an isolated case. It is one in a long and growing list of places where stories were erased with brutal efficiency. The mass graves keep surfacing, revealing what everyone already knew, but the government refused to acknowledge. In January 2025, authorities uncovered the remains of 56 individuals in unmarked graves near the United States border. The month before that, in a suburb of Guadalajara, they pulled dozens of bags from the ground, each one filled with dismembered remains belonging to 24 different victims. In northern Chihuahua, 12 victims were discovered in secret burial sites, and near Ciudad Juarez, another 12 were dumped in shallow pits. In Chiapas, 31 deceased individuals were retrieved from cartel-controlled land, where the soil itself seemed soaked with terror. It became increasingly clear that this was part of a long, terrifying pattern. However, while some mass graves are buried in secrecy, others are erased in ways so nightmarish they sound almost unreal. The cartel stew maker who dissolved hundreds. For years, Santiago Meza Lopez had a job so gruesome, so unthinkable, that it made even hardened cartel members shudder. His task? Dissolve the deceased, hundreds of them, until nothing was left but sludge. They called him El Pozolero, or the stew maker, because what he did eerily resembled making pozole, a traditional Mexican stew. Instead of hominy, spices, and tender meat, though, his ingredients were cadavers, acid, and sodium hydroxide. So what was his crime? Dissolving at least 300 victims in acid for a powerful drug cartel. At first, when the criminal was caught, he got only a shockingly light 10-year sentence, one that meant he should have walked free in 2022. However, the Mexican court handed Meza Lopez an additional 30 years behind bars. Here's the catch, though. His new sentence has nothing to do with dissolving victims. Instead, he was convicted of kidnapping and organized crime ties, a legal loophole that kept him from slipping back into society. The extension came after years of pressure from law enforcement and outraged community members who refused to let the stew maker taste freedom. You see, Meza Lopez didn't just end people's lives, he erased them. As an enforcer for the Arellano Felix cartel, one of the most notorious drug syndicates in Mexico, he operated out of a ranch in Ensenada, about 70 miles south of the United States border. His routine was as horrifying as it was methodical. Victims were placed in industrial-sized tubs filled with acid and sodium hydroxide. He would stir for 8 hours, ensuring that all traces were dissolved. By the end, only teeth, nails, and a few bone fragments remained, small enough to be easily discarded. For this nightmarish task, he was paid a mere $600 a week. It wasn't until investigators dug through his property that they made a sickening discovery. Between 14,000 and 15,000 human remains were buried in an empty lot. In the end, for the families of Mexico's missing, it was a small victory in an endless battle. At the time of his arrest, relatives of over 100 missing people in Baja California wanted to show Meza Lopez photos of their loved ones, hoping for a glimmer of truth. Did they meet their fate in his acid-filled drums? Could he offer the closure they've been denied for years? State Attorney General Rommel Moreno even considered allowing them to meet with Meza Lopez, a chance to ask the question no one should ever have to. Had it not been for public pressure, Meza Lopez could have been a free man right now. However, thanks to relentless activism and determined families, El Pozolero will spend the rest of his life behind bars, right where he belongs. Yet his story is just one piece of a much larger horror. El Pozolero's methods were designed to make victims disappear without a trace. In San Fernando, though, the cartels didn't bother hiding the horror. They left mass graves as a warning to all. San Fernando's massacres. For years, Mexico had seen violence, but mass graves? That was something new. Then came 2011, and everything changed. Just south of the Texas border, in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, authorities stumbled upon something that would haunt the nation forever. Nearly 200 victims, buried in makeshift graves. It was a discovery so gruesome, so shocking, that it forced the country to confront a terrifying new reality. What made it even more chilling, though? This wasn't San Fernando's first massacre. A year before the mass graves were found in 2010, another horror unfolded in San Fernando. 72 migrants, many from Central America, were brutally executed on a remote ranch. What was their crime? Refusing to join the Zetas cartel. You see, the Zetas, one of the most ruthless drug cartels in Mexico, had given them an ultimatum: work for us or face the consequences. They chose dignity over terror, and for that, they paid with their lives. Just a year later, even more remains were turning up in shallow pits across the region. Back in 2011, forensic experts uncovered 116 victims within just 1 week. The Mexican government quickly pointed the finger at the Zetas cartel, confirming what many had feared. San Fernando had become a place where deceased individuals were disposed of. However, the nightmare wasn't just about the numbers. These were people with families. Yet, identifying them was proving nearly impossible. In response to the executions, 17 suspects were arrested. However, in a region where cartels outgun and outmaneuver the authorities, was justice even possible? Mexican Attorney General Marisela Morales confirmed that all 116 victims had died at the hands of organized crime, their lives cut short by Zetas' brutality. Of course, the grisly discoveries began with a single confession. A cartel member who had been arrested broke under questioning. He revealed that buses traveling through the region had been hijacked, the passengers dragged off into the unknown. Then, the truth unraveled. Victims weren't just executed, they were forced into a barbaric match. Cartel enforcers turned kidnapped migrants into gladiators, making them bludgeon each other fatally with sledgehammers. The winners were spared, but only if they pledged loyalty to the cartel. For those who refused, a bullet, a shallow grave, another nameless victim in San Fernando's execution fields. Now, San Fernando's execution fields were a horror show, but what happened next was even darker. Just when it seemed the violence couldn't get worse, the cartels turned a prison into something far more terrifying. A prison turned execution chamber. Some prisons are places of punishment. Others are places of reform. However, Piedras Negras became a place of pure evil, a secret slaughterhouse where remains of victims vanished into flames, never to be found again. Between 2010 and 2011, the notorious Los Zetas cartel turned the Piedras Negras prison in Coahuila, Mexico, into something out of a horror movie. It wasn't a correctional facility. It wasn't even a cartel hideout. It was a factory for the deceased. Piedras Negras, officially called Centro de Readaptación Social, was supposed to house criminals. Instead, it was overrun by the very people it was meant to imprison. Los Zetas, a cartel born from Mexico's elite military deserters, had already infiltrated the state's police, government, and security forces. Taking over a prison, though, gave them something even more terrifying: a secret execution site where no one could stop them. Inside those walls, the Zetas did what they did best: slaying, torturing, and making deceased individuals disappear. The cartel turned the prison into their personal execution ground, executing anyone they saw as a threat. Rival gang members, suspected informants, and even innocent people who got caught in the crossfire. What was even more gruesome was that this prison had incineration in barrels. This means victims were burned in diesel-filled barrels so that nothing remained. Even forensic teams found almost nothing left behind. Ultimately, the scale of the horror inside that prison was impossible to measure. No official record exists of how many people were slain and incinerated there. However, this wasn't just a Piedras Negras problem. It was part of a much bigger nightmare unfolding across Coahuila. In 2011, the nearby town of Allende became the site of one of the most chilling massacres in Mexican history. Over 3 days, an estimated 300 people were wiped out: men, women, children, and entire families. The Zetas didn't just end their lives, they kidnapped them, tortured them, and incinerated their remains, just as they had done in the prison. Some victims were subjected to chemical decomposition and their remains were disposed of. Others were set on fire until nothing remained but fragments and the smoke of their erased existence. Yet for years, no one talked about it. No investigations, no outcry, just whispers of what had happened, passed between those too afraid to speak out loud. It wasn't until 2017 that researchers from El Colegio de Mexico exposed the truth in a report that left the country shaken. The study confirmed what many had feared all along. Piedras Negras wasn't just a prison. It was a human extermination camp, operating under the watchful eye of authorities who either didn't care or were too terrified to intervene. If Piedras Negras was a hidden slaughterhouse, though, Labartina was proof that the horror wasn't confined to prison walls. It stretched across Mexico. Labartina Field of Bones and Silence. For years, it was just a rumor, a grim whisper that spread through Matamoros, growing louder with every missing person. The authorities brushed it off, as they always did. Just another cartel story. Just another unconfirmed site where lives had been erased. Then, in 2021, Jorge Macias, the Tamaulipas search commissioner, finally stepped onto that cursed ground, and what he saw left him frozen. Pelvic bones, skulls, femurs, everything just thrown there. I told myself, this can't be real, he later told the Associated Press. It was real, though. More real than anyone was ready to admit. Labartina, a desolate stretch of land just 12 kilometers from the United States border in Brownsville, Texas, had been a dumping ground for years. The Gulf Cartel, one of Mexico's most ruthless criminal organizations, had turned it into an extermination site where the remains of their victims were discarded, burned, and left to rot under the scorching sun. Forensic experts couldn't even count the victims. Instead, they measured the horror in weight, half a ton of skeletal remains. By July 2021, the families of the disappeared in Tamaulipas had reached their breaking point. They knew the authorities wouldn't help them. They knew justice wasn't coming. So, in an act of desperation, they wrote a letter, not to the government, but to the cartel. This later stated, "We are not looking for culprits. We are looking for our sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, and relatives." However, in a region where mass graves are uncovered like clockwork, hope is a fragile thing. The thing is, Labartina is not an anomaly. It's one of 57 known extermination sites in Tamaulipas alone. Since 2012, groups searching for the disappeared have uncovered remote sites where cartels discreetly disposed of their victims. Each time a new site is discovered, it feels like history repeating itself. San Fernando, Allende, Piedras Negras, places where the earth holds secrets no one wants to unearth. Yet, for every massive grave site that comes to light, there are countless others still waiting to be found. Just days before their desperate letter to the Gulf Cartel, another group of grieving families made a plea, not to the criminals who took their loved ones, but to the authorities who had long ignored their suffering. The United Forces for Our Disappeared in Nuevo León issued a press release demanding action. 5 known extermination sites. More than 600,000 skeletal remains recovered since 2010. Still, no justice. By 2022, forensic teams had recovered a staggering 1,100 pounds of bones from Labartina alone. Even then, the digging hasn't stopped. Labartina is just one of at least 15 extermination sites across Tamaulipas, each one a silent graveyard for those who never got a proper burial. However, Labartina was just one chapter in a much bloodier book, one where entire cities became graveyards, and the streets of Guadalajara were no exception. Guadalajara's horrifying atrocities. On the night of November 24, 2011, Guadalajara became a graveyard in plain sight. 3 trucks, abandoned in the middle of a major avenue, carried something out of a nightmare. 26 lifeless remains, crammed together like discarded cargo. The city, already no stranger to cartel violence, had never seen anything quite like this. Just after 7 p.m., the emergency lines lit up. Panicked callers described a gruesome sight, vehicles filled with deceased individuals, left out in the open as if daring authorities to find them. When police arrived, they found the scene exactly as reported. A green Dodge Caravan sat motionless in the center of the highway, its doors wide open, revealing a pile of victims. 20 meters away, a Nissan Caravan held more of the deceased. On the far right lane, a white van completed the grotesque display. These weren't just deceased individuals. They were a message and a demonstration of power. At first, investigators believed the victims were members of the Sinaloa cartel, slaughtered in a revenge act orchestrated by Los Zetas and the Milenio cartel. However, as identities were uncovered, the truth became even more chilling. Only 6 had criminal records. 10 had been reported missing by their families before ending up in these vans. Some had been small business owners, a mechanic, a cook, a dentist, a truck driver, a house painter. Ordinary people caught in the web of something monstrous. Whoever orchestrated this massacre didn't care who lived or died. Innocence was irrelevant. The terror that gripped Guadalajara on that November night didn't begin with the discovery of the remains, though. It started long before, in the shadows, in the quiet moments before lives were torn away. Families remember it vividly. The sudden arrival of heavily armed men, the frantic shouts, the desperate pleas. And then, just like that, their loved ones were gone. One witness recalled seeing teenagers, just kids, sipping soda outside a corner store when 2 trucks rolled up. The doors flew open, and within moments, they were gone, swept away into the night by men who gave no explanation. When the authorities finally captured members of the Milenio cartel, they had a very different story. They insisted that the deceased were not innocent at all. They called them Los Torcidos, another name for the Jalisco New Generation cartel. In the ruthless game of cartel vengeance, though, one massacre is never enough. What began in Guadalajara was about to spill over into Chapala. The Jalisco Massacres. The road to Chapala, a peaceful retreat for American retirees, turned into a horrifying scene on the morning of May 9, 2012. What should have been an ordinary day in Jalisco began with an anonymous call, one that would unravel a horror too brutal to comprehend. 2 abandoned vehicles, a Toyota Sienna and a Ford EcoSport, stood eerily still by the highway. When authorities arrived, they made a discovery that would send shockwaves across Mexico. Inside lay the dismembered remains of 18 people. Some of the remains had been preserved while the rest showed advanced signs of decay. The authorities knew the signatures all too well. A note left behind pointed to the masterminds: Los Zetas and the Milenio Cartel, two of the most ruthless factions in Mexico's drug war. Investigators quickly linked the massacre to an ongoing cycle of revenge, payback for the 23 people massacred just days earlier in Nuevo Laredo. However, the bloodshed wasn't over. Just a day before, 25 people had been kidnapped in Tala, Jalisco, and lined up for execution. The criminals had plans to put their remains on public display, a grim encore to the horror unfolding in Chapala. Somehow, miraculously, 10 managed to escape, racing to the media to expose the nightmare they had barely survived. The others weren't so lucky. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.